Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar and for your patience as we sorted through some of our logistical issues. My name is Sabrina, and I am the Managing Director at the Cancer Collaborative. And I'm honored to have with me today Jatinder Harshawal from the NHS. I hope I pronounced that properly. Just before we get started, I'd like to remind you that there will be a Q&A session after Jat's presentation. You do have a Q&A icon on your screen where you can enter your questions directly, and you can enter them as they come to you. We did provide sufficient time for questions at the end of the presentation. And for those of you who were not in attendance, Jat did present at the PCPA CCO Biosimilar Summit in Oncology last November. So I'm really glad that we are able to get him here today to speak to a larger audience. As you are aware, Europe and the UK have implemented a successful and sustainable biosimilar strategy. And the purpose of this webinar series is to provide some insight into that experience, the learnings and best practices that have been developed, and how that can be translated into Canadian context as we look to introduce biosimilars in oncology here in Canada. Jatinder has been a hospital pharmacist for over 25 years. He is currently chief pharmacist and a clinical director in the Royal Marsden Hospital, a world-leading cancer hospital leading a team of 140 staff to ensure patients receive the most up-to-date medicines in the safest way. Jatinder is also the medicines lead for the RM Partners West London Cancer Alliance, a program designed to test new and innovative pathways to improve the earlier diagnosis of patients with cancer, and recently led on a program to introduce biosimilar Rituximab safely and consistently in oncology. Jatinder is currently the chair of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society's Hospital Expert Advisory Group and the London Chief Pharmacists Group. Jatinder has been a chief pharmacist for over 14 years in various hospitals, including Brighton and Ealing. Jatinder has previously worked in a number of different pharmacist roles in various hospitals across London, including Barts, King's College, and Charing Cross hospitals. He qualified in 1991 with a Bachelor in Pharmacy degree and became a member of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. Jatinder obtained an MSc in clinical pharmacy practice in 1996 from London and completed a diploma in management studies in 2000 with the Kingston University. And he's currently a Health Foundation Fellow and has recently completed the Health Foundation's Masters in Leadership and Quality Improvement Program Generation Q. So with that, Jad, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Sabrina, thank you for that welcome. Really delighted to share the experience we've got from the NHS in England. I apologise you can't see me, well, I don't think you can. Unfortunately, I'm looking after an ill daughter today, but so I'm at home, but hopefully you can hear me okay and you can see the slides, which is the important bit. And I'm happy to take questions throughout the whole of this presentation. So, as Sabrina said, I've had a bit of experience in the last 3 years, really looking at how we introduced, first of all, biosimilar Rituximab, and then a bit more recently, biosimilar Trastuzumab as well, which became available just over 12 months ago here in the NHS in England. But today what I'm going to do is talk a bit about the introduction of biosimilar Ritux, the experience we gained in the NHS, but also perhaps some of that shared learning. And some of you might have seen me when I came over to Toronto to come and speak to you. A bit about, I suppose, how we approached it and why we're quite proud of what we've done and how we think this can be translated and used in other countries. So if we go into the next slide, for me, Sabrina, I suppose I always kick off with a bit of context as to why we want to focus on biosimilars, why there is so much focus on biosimilars in the NHS in England. And part of that, I think this picture here, this graph shows you the rising costs of the NHS drugs bill. And this is for the NHS in England. And due to all the reasons that I'm sure you're seeing across Canada with people living longer, the greater focus on innovative medicines and the cost of those more specialist medicines being approved and used, we are seeing an increase in costs in the rising drug budget. And so at the moment, I would say when I first did this slide in 2016-17, we saw that actually the spend was getting close to £20 billion. It was 17.4 billion in 16-17, and actually that was going to rise even greater after that. So we were aiming that this was going to probably hit us close to 20 billion by the time we get to 2020. But if you look at the graph, it has begun to level out a little bit in the last couple of years. And some of that And the majority of that has been some of the work we've done on biosimilars here in the NHS. And I'm going to talk a bit about the impact of not just Ritux, but also the impact of trastuzumab and other biosimilars like adalimumab as well. So all of this in the context of rising drug spend, what we were trying to do was say, well, actually, what can we do to get best value from medicines? So how do we ensure we can fund these future innovative medicines at a high cost, but make sure we're getting the best value out of other medicines? So you can see here, one of the areas of growth is clearly hospital spend, whereas primary care spend in the NHS has very much flattened out due to generics. The hospital spend was the one that was rising at the greatest rate. So if you go to the next slide, please, Sabrina. The opportunity then came about when we knew, probably in 2016, we knew that IV rituximab, MabThera, as it was known here in the NHS in England, was coming to the end of its patent. And we were able to then start predicting when the first biosimilars for rituximab might become available. But we also did realize that when you look at the previous uptake of biosimilars, actually we had a really, really inconsistent approach. We had an inconsistent uptake. And I think we just really didn't understand the incentives or the levers that were going to help people feel confident in using biosimilars and use that consistently across the country. If I can just flip one slide forward, Sabrina, and then I'll come back to this slide again. This slide here just shows you in 16-17, two of the previous biosimilars that had been available for a number of years in the NHS in England. This is infliximab and etanercept. And this is a graph that shows a regional variation in uptake after years of both the biosimilar and originator being available. It shows you we had quite an inconsistent approach. We had some parts of the country where there was a large amount of biosimilar use, and you can see here in the southwest of England. And then you had other parts in the West Midlands, central part of England, where simply the mix was a lot more still being used, a lot more of the originators still being used compared to the biosimilar, and yet everybody was provided with similar information. And if you look at etanercept, it was even greater the mix that was going on. So if we just go back one slide again, Sabrina, back to my 3. Just go back 2 slides from here, please. And one thing we did know about biosimilar Ritux was that the spend on the on the IV originator rituximab. Oh no, you need to go backwards, I'm afraid. The spend on the IV rituximab was £160 million in 2016-17. And so we knew that there was a potential to get huge amounts of savings for the NHS if we did this correctly, but in a safe way. And the only way we were going to do that was really not only identifying the key stakeholders, but actually having a system-wide approach whereby we had all those key stakeholders on board. So we wanted to have a very different approach for biosimilar Ritux, and we also knew it was going to be a lot more sensitive. This was the first biosimilar in hematology in any cancer-related treatment, and so we had to make sure that we were absolutely assured that it was a drug was going to give the same effect, so we can give that assurance to clinicians, nurses, pharmacists, but more importantly to our patients as well. So with that in mind, if you go down now 2 slides to the Cancer Vanguard program slide, that's it. So the opportunity coincided when the NHS back in 2015, it seems such a long time ago now, 4 years ago, when the National Cancer Vanguard was launched. And it was launched particularly by following the NHS plan at that point to test and fast track innovative new multi-cancer care. But within that, the 3 sites of the Cancer Vanguard, which were, as you can see from this slide, the northwest and southwest London, so the west of London together, which is led by the Royal Marsden Hospital called RM Partners, of which I'm the lead for the medicines work. And the Greater Manchester was the second component of the Cancer Vanguard. And then there was another part of London, the north and northeast part of London, which is led by University College London Hospitals. So we had some very large cancer providers come together, and with that, we're able to get the expertise, testing new models, looking at issues like early diagnosis. But importantly, from my point of view, it allowed the 3 chief pharmacists from those hospitals and their partner hospitals in those areas to come together and actually try and have what we described as a system-wide approach to introducing biosimilars for those 3 hospitals and areas and networks, and then see if we could make that available for the rest of the country. So we utilize the opportunity of the Cancer Vanguard program and utilize the access to that expertise that we were going to have available at our fingertips through the Vanguard. So if you go to the next slide. So we did this by setting up a medicines optimization project for the Vanguard, and we invited companies to work with us on a series of different projects. And one of the companies that worked with us was Sandoz. And I must stress at this point, this was in a non-promotional way. But what we said to the companies was, you have a chance to make a difference to some of the healthcare and drive some efficiencies in healthcare. And you'll have, in return, you have access to some of the key chief pharmacists and clinicians from the Marsden, UCL, and the Christie. And so we had this open invite for companies to approach us. Sandoz said, we'd like to work with you on how we can develop a centralized repository of information which would aid the introduction of biosimilar rituximab. And actually that struck a chord, because we knew when the Vanguard was launched that in the following year to 18 months, there was an opportunity that the first biosimilar would be available. So the timing was everything, but certainly the will of having one of the companies to help support us to move at pace and be able to help us produce some of the materials, fast track them and get the acceptance through all three hospitals. There's no mean feat, and I'm sure you have similar things in Canada, across Canada, whereby often we were repeating work across organizations rather than sharing work. And what we wanted to do was just do this once, get it right first time, and hopefully share it with our colleagues across the country, thereby negating the need to duplicate the same amount of work, but at the same time, hopefully allow people to have the assurance that if three very large centres like UCL, the Christie in Manchester, and the Royal Marsden were producing information for biosimilar rituximab, and we're going to start using it, then it'd give a degree of assurance to other hospitals and patient groups. So what we wanted to do was, in order to develop this centralised repository of information, of course, as I mentioned previously, we wanted to engage key clinical stakeholders and develop material that could do. We started at quite basic levels in terms of developing frequently asked questions and making sure there were education sessions being run. And that was really important, because 3 years ago when we started this work, I can assure you that the awareness of biosimilars was at a pretty low level. And I would say most people were very, very wary about using biosimilars, and particularly for rituximab, because they didn't know how biosimilars were made, or how they were produced, what regulation process they had to go through to get approved and licensed. And so we started quite low level in running a series of education sessions, producing documents on frequently asked questions and policy statements. But actually what we did was not only engage with key stakeholders like clinicians and various people, and I'll run through that list in a moment, but we also wanted to involve patient groups all throughout this whole journey. We recognize the importance of that, and we recognize that we wanted to, we needed to listen to what our patients were saying about the opportunity to use rituximab and possibly starting to use a biosimilar for that. But the other thing we wanted to do as part of this overall repository of information, we wanted to develop policies that could be introduced in all hospitals around the country a lot quicker, and without having the other people having to rewrite it from scratch. Then my point about trying to avoid duplication, but sharing it so people could actually just be able to draw down policies that they could introduce very quickly and locally and localize it, was one of our key aims as we did this. So if we go on to our next slide, that identifies the range of stakeholders, and I would urge all of you, if you haven't done this so far, and I know you are starting on a lot of this work already, but just to re-emphasize the stakeholders to consider whenever you are looking at introducing a big change, but particularly here with biosimilars. We started with our patient groups. I've listed them here because they were part of all of it. I include them in my clinical stakeholders because that's how we viewed them. We couldn't make a decision without running it through our patients, and that was vital to everything we tried to develop. But as well as them, we had our hematologists, nursing, pharmacy colleagues. And I would say, don't underestimate or don't overestimate the knowledge people might have about biosimilars at an early stage, because it did vary. It did vary on people's experience and what they might have heard. I think we've moved on a lot in these last couple of years with our understanding and acceptance of biosimilars, But we found 3 years ago, we were having to do a lot of work in that first 6 months to do education sessions and improve that awareness. On a more practical point of view, if you look at once you've got your clinical engagement, the other stakeholders were your pharmacy, I suppose your operational teams, as well as your clinical pharmacists and their awareness. It was your procurement teams, your formulary, understanding every different person's formulary approach and how they were approved, whether they were approved on an area perspective or locally, or if they had e-prescribing systems in place or not. We wanted to make sure we tried to address every one of those questions people might ask. We also realized across a trust, the local drug approval processes generally were drug and therapeutics committees. So we even went as far as saying, here's a series of drug and therapeutic submissions that you can share across your organization. So we wanted to make this really easy. And in all of this, of course, you can't make these changes, I think, if you haven't engaged your professional groups and those bodies. So for us, we wanted to see what information is available and position statements from groups like ESMO, the European Society of Medical Oncology, and also important groups like the British Oncology Pharmacy Association, because for us, they were the groups that we wanted to make sure we liaised with, and we had the consistent messaging. So that was really important for us. And then last but not least, one of the things that we realized why previous biosimilars perhaps had good uptake was where you had localized incentives for people wanting to change. So as well as a clinical argument and you do your changes, actually if you incentivize the system, and that doesn't always mean financially, it might be investment back into services, but whatever that incentive was, that did enable it a little bit more. And so what we wanted to do was work very closely with both our local, but in this case, more importantly, our national commissioners. And we do have an advantage there because that for us was NHS England, that's what NHSE stands for. And they were the ones who predominantly funded the expenditure on biosimilar Rituximab. So they were a key person we had to also engage with. If we go on to our next slide, you can have all of that information available, and you can have all of this information planned with the greatest coordination. But one of the things is if you don't have this in an easily accessible information across the country, then you do end up having, people just simply not utilizing the information that is there. So for us, we then focused a lot of our attention was putting together all that hard work we've done into this website, and Sabrina's just put you onto that. So we created this Cancer Vanguard biosimilar adoption process timeline. Not the best worded, I accept, and it's probably, we at the time it suited the purpose that we were trying to achieve. And you can see here on this particular slide, it will show you from the left-hand side, 6 months before a biosimilar is going to be launched. It's got various boxes there, and they're a timeline of what we suggested people needed to follow in order to maximize the opportunity when a biosimilar is going to become available. So it starts quite logically with your horizon scanning of what might become available, whether that's going to be through your local commissioners, national commissioners, might be through the drug companies, but your awareness of what's coming through. And then how do you start forming your groups somewhere between 3 and 6 months before the products are available to have this all aligned. And the reason why we did this way was we recognized that if we truly believe biosimilars were going to offer a better value for treatments, then you'd want to maximize that. We wanted to maximize the uptake of those so that we could make larger efficiencies for the NHS. That could be reinvested back in services, but most organizations also were able to act in an agile way and respond to new ones becoming available. And I think that's why we put this timeline going through the middle of this graph here of 6 months before, and certainly accelerating with the amount of work you need to do 3 months before, and then obviously that launch, but not stopping there, because we also then said you also need to take time to review, monitor your patients who are on a biosimilar and collecting some of that real world evidence data. Really important to do that, even once you've made those changes. But I'm going to take you through a couple of these, just a few bits, and show you how we made this. We're proud of this because it was something that was set up, and a lot of people have accessed it, and you can all access this. Whoever's listening in, you can type in cancer Vanguard biosimilar timeline, and it will take you to this graph. And all of this, we wanted it available for anyone in the country and internationally. So you can hear bits of this talk, you can hear feedback, you can download all the documents. But if you go into the next slide, so I'm going to pretend I'm clicking on staff education now. So it should light up on the next slide down again. And if you click onto that next slide, and if you just press the next slide down, it takes you into, clicks onto staff education, into the documents that are hidden behind this particular website. And here we've given a checklist of the types of information you want to ensure has been articulated and shared with your key stakeholders. And we've also then built in a lot of the information into this particular slide set. So now if you go into, if you click, pretend I'm clicking on the right-hand side, biosimilars education slide deck, it will take you to this, a series of slides which are all about how everything from how biologics are manufactured and the process of where you take a modified host cell, how that's grown, how that's extracted, purified and formulated. But also it takes you a bit more into the science of the variability that exists when you're looking at biologics from batch to batch, but also the tests that are carried out, the numerous tests that are carried out whenever you have one batch of a monoclonal antibody to the next, and also some of the important aspects that you always need to check that are within parameters to ensure you've got the same clinical impact. And there's some, I'm not going to go through that with you all today, but you can look at the slides and it will show you here about when you have a manufacturing change, you can sometimes see some of the attributes change, and some of that could just be, you see here, the ADCC potency, and that's quite an accepted measure for activity of these monoclonal antibodies, particularly for rituximab and its anti-CD20 activity. But you will have those regular tests that take place for every batch of monoclonal antibody. And the main point to make here is that you always see a small degree of variation from batch to batch, because you are dealing with live cells and natural variation occurs. However, the clinical effect remains the same. If you go on to the next slide, it shows you, even throughout these series of slides and presentations that you'll see on the website, that and many of you will have seen this, I'm sure, where you've got the numerous manufacturing changes that take place for different monoclonal antibodies. And there was just a suite of different monoclonal antibodies and the number of changes that they have gone through. And some of those manufacturing changes would have been classed as low risk, majority of them are. And that might mean you're just using different types of filters, but some would get into a more moderate or even a higher risk. And that's when you're using a completely different cell line or maybe a completely different manufacturing units. But the key thing to raise here is that actually variability is a fact of life. You know that's going to occur, but also manufacturing changes are quite frequent as well. And most of those are small scale. Most people wouldn't even be aware of those. But the key thing is that over the course of a lifetime of a particular monoclonal antibody, you will see there are always subtle changes that take place. It doesn't change the clinical impact of those. And most people were not aware that they were to the extent of these. And I think people often look at Infliximab and see the 50 plus changes with the originator product, but they also notice with Rituximab there have been 23 changes, and they aren't a risk at all. It's just saying the testing that has to take place to demonstrate that they are still having the same effect still takes place on these batch to batch changes. And likewise, you would see that for biosimilars. So variability being a fact of life. And then if you click on the bottom of that slide, it takes you to the next one. And do that, please, Sabrina. Then it shows you at a simple click of a button, you can go straight back. Oh, probably jumped too many there, but it takes you straight back to the core slides, that adoption timeline. And then from there, you can easily go back at any point to another section of the whole process where you've got more documents. And Sabrina's very kindly clicked onto the engaging patient groups. And I just want to mention this because I stated they were core to whenever we decided to do any changes with biosimilars. When you click on that, it'll take you to how we engage with patient groups and the importance of doing that and the appropriate patient forum. And for us, in this case, if we click on the right-hand side, second one down, you'll see there, go to the next slide, that we co-created a patient information leaflet with the Lymphoma Association here in the UK. And that, for me, was really important. It was important because we wanted their input. We wanted to co-produce something that met the needs of our patients, but then also we understood more as well of the important types of questions people were looking for. One of the things we are proud about is that we produce one patient information leaflet that was shared across the country. And that's quite, again, this issue of duplication was first and foremost in our minds. We didn't want people having to write their own PILs, so we decided to do that for them. And I'm pleased to say most people are using these around the country. So, so that's good. And a couple of other things I should say about patients. We didn't actually reconsent patients because they were consented with treatment for rituximab as part of their treatment regime. But we did say and gave them the patient information leaflets to say you're using a biosimilar in case they had questions. But we didn't change the consent process for new patients because as an organisation, we believed they were going to have the same clinical effect. And that's an important fact. I often get asked about that. And it worked fine. Having said that, I think it's important, even at a later stage, years later, patients do understand what they're on. And so we do try and make sure our nurses, pharmacists, doctors are all well versed in understanding about biosimilars so they can answer any questions that patients might have in the future as well. If we go on to our next slide, what I would say as well is once you've got the clinical support and the education and you've got your patient support, the trust approvals were also really quite important. So what we did as part of the Vanguard program was the medical directors, the chief pharmacists, the chairs of the Drug and Therapeutics Committee, if they were different, from all three of those main large hospitals, the Marsden, UCL and Christie, signed support to say we were going to start using biosimilars as soon as they became available for rituximab. We had the policies agreed across the three sites and shared those on the website. And we became the first centres to start using the biosimilars. So in particular, UCL and ourselves were pretty much the first sites that began to use biosimilar rituximab. And I'll go through some of that data in a moment. But I think I said earlier on about one of your key stakeholders being your commissioners. And here, the commissioner support was absolutely critical. And next slide. The timing of this was really important because in September 2017, we did work with NHS England to ensure that the commissioning framework for biological medicines was produced. They were already writing that, but we were able to feed in about the potential impact of not just biologics, but also biosimilars. And you can see here the potential to realise savings of £200 to £300 million per year was estimated by 2020-21 with the pipeline of biosimilars that were going to become available. And this was written when September 17 was just when rituximab was going to be available across the NHS in England. And also we knew that there were going to be at least 3 or 4 others coming through, like trastuzumab and adalimumab are the two key ones that have driven even greater savings. And I think if I was to update these slides today, it's probably just to let you know that this commissioning framework has just been updated in the last 2 weeks, and the NHS England are talking about biosimilars with greater confidence. And the interesting thing is as well as having this 90% of new patients to be prescribed a best value biologic within 3 months of launch, which is still a target, the actual savings they're now predicting are double what's written here. So it's £400 to £500 million that they expect to have saved by this time next year. So that's all been updated and the learning of what we've done with things like rituximab. So if we go on to our next slide, I mentioned that ourselves in UCL were one of the first sites that did switch all of our patients to biosimilar rituximab July 17, and by September 17, there were regional tenders done around the country, so which allowed people to draw down the best value biosimilar to use in their area. And but we collected data because we'd started a little earlier when one was available. And the first 317 patients, 800 infusions, we saw mainly grade 1 and grade 2 reactions, completely in line with the originators. And I say that because we collected the data on some of our originator product use in the 6 months leading up to our switch. And that's another thing just to bear in mind when you are looking to introduce biosimilars, is having your data collected in advance of making any changes. I would say that's really important. I'm now PI for a European-wide study, which is looking at a number of centres across Europe. And I must say, we're still part of Europe at the moment, thankfully. I can still say that. Not sure I will be saying that after October, but that's just one of the things. But we are, and so as part of this European-wide study, we are collecting the adverse events for the rapid infusions of biosimilar rituximab. I'm going to compare that to the originator. And I say that because when I've written on this slide, no practical problems were noticed, was that we went as far as saying if patients were on the rapid infusion of rituximab, as in the originator, we continued that with the biosimilar rituximab because we had the belief they were the same drug, they should have a similar adverse reaction profile. And so UCL and ourselves made that switch and kept them on fast infusion, so it didn't have an impact on patients' chair time. And that was well received. That was well received, and we saw no problems again, no practical problems or adverse events with those patients. So that was good. So if we go on to the next slide and come to the end, my last 3 or 4 slides. I suppose the other thing to say here is this is what this graph is showing you the uptake of biosimilars as we stand in the NHS in England. So we've done it via months. Now, if I start from right and go left, so in the light blue here shows you the infliximab, and then the purple line is your etanercept, and you can see the uptake. Actually, it was quite slow. It was quite slow over the months, even by I think a year. On average, maybe less than 50% uptake. Has gone up now, and it's accelerated since we did the work. The knock-on effect of doing the work with the biosimilar Ritux is that more people began to use the other biosimilars as well. The green line shows you the rituximab uptake, and as we stand today, the uptake is probably close. I think the actual figure is about 98% across the NHS in England. That's all hospitals across the NHS in England. 98% are using biosimilar Ritux. The red line against that, just before that, is showing that we're probably getting a little bit quicker and smarter on this because that's the trastuzumab biosimilar uptake. And so within, I think, 6 months, we'd hit 90%. And the latest figures on that, I can tell you, are 98% uptake of 98% use of intravenous trastuzumab is the biosimilar. So we didn't touch the subcutaneous because we know that's very important to our patients, but it was the intravenous trastuzumab, 98% uptake. And there is a little blue line you might see on your slide, on this graph on the far left-hand side, which actually is adalimumab, which has only just come out towards the end of 2018. And actually that's getting up even quicker. So the uptake, we're getting smarter at it. It's making a big difference. And I suppose the line at the bottom of this graph shows you that the full national savings at 98% for rituximab alone was 100 million. And hence, when I mentioned the NHS expects to save between 400 and 500 million on these biosimilars, actually on just even those 3, the Ritux, trastuzumab, and adalimumab, that's being realised. So that's good. So if I go into my next slide, summary here, I suppose for me is there is now widespread support from the NHS for switching to biosimilars. This project, it was probably one of the nicest projects to have been part of, where we worked really closely with colleagues from the Marsden, the Christie, and UCL, and also colleagues from Sandoz. And it's not often I say that about the industry where there's where it's just simply not promotional. And this really wasn't promotional. It was we were not able to move at pace and produce all of that information on those websites without the support of them. And I'm quite open about it because I think it's a great example of that. And we had a countrywide impact. There's no doubt the Commission guidance is a key enabler, and it's something to consider when you're approaching this in Canada. Actually, how do you incentivize the system? I've just come back from a number of talks I did across Australia, where we were discussing this journey and trying to understand when and how they might introduce biosimilar rituximab in their hematology centres. And they've just, I believe, biosimilar Ritux will be available come October, and really sharing the approach we had. And I'm hoping that will just help them speed up, but also give the assurance of not just the approach and when you've switched and the documents, but also some of that real world evidence data. And just having that, I'm hoping this is giving you all on this webinar also that assurance and confidence to be able to do this at pace, but also with the key people you need to engage with as you go on that journey. Because adoption, as I've written here, will only succeed with that multi-stakeholder approach. The replicability of what we've done has been repeated with both trastuzumab and adalimumab, and that's been really pleasing. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to go to just next slide to say acknowledgements. In particular, thanks to Tim McCarthy, one of my principal pharmacists at the Marsden, who led a lot of this work and did a lot of the groundwork for it, and colleagues from Sandoz, I should say, because without them, this wouldn't have been possible. And I'll pause there and happily take any questions, Sabrina.
Thank you, Jack. I'm going to start. I've got a few questions, and I'll let people type in their questions as I'm asking you some questions.
Super.
I think that your collaboration with industry in a non-promotional way is really interesting, and it's not something that we generally see in this space. So I would like if you could just talk to us a little bit more about that, how it was developed, the process. I know when you presented in Toronto last November, it was sort of a contest that was open to all industry to participate.
It was, yes. So yeah, well remembered, Sabrina. So it was interesting because we called it the Pharma Challenge, and the reason why we called it that was when the Cancer Vanguard was set up, and often with these new government-led initiatives, the industry are often very, very keen to come and see how they can work with you. And so all three chief pharmacists from the three sites, from UCL, from the Christie and here in the Marsden, we were probably getting people knocking on our doors every day, and we just began to get a bit wearing, if I'm honest. So what we decided to do was turn it around and say, do you know, there is a chance for all of you to work with us, but we're going to give you a 30-day turnaround. We gave them a form and said, have a read of these forms and what we would like to aim to achieve from a medicines point of view in this next 2 years of the Cancer Vanguard program, and actually come back to us with a project proposal. Tell us how you will support it. What do you need from the NHS? And actually, how do we make sure it's not promotional? It can't be seen as promotional, otherwise we weren't going to accept it. And we put this call out to the whole pharmaceutical industry community, and they only had a month. They had a month to pull together some project proposals back to us. And I think we received 40 projects back in 1 month. And so the three chief pharmacists from the sites, plus the lead nurses from those three sites and some clinicians, we all then reviewed every one of those projects against set criteria about impact, feasibility, actually, is it transferable, is it replicable across the NHS? And we chose a number of projects. Some of those were developing models for delivery of chemotherapy near a home. Others were to develop monitoring of adverse events using some new app designs. And one of the projects chosen was introduction of biosimilars with a focus on rituximab. And we had very tight governance around there for a couple of ways. One, everyone had a project board. Every month it met. There was also all sign-off had to go up to the chief exec groups to make sure they were aware of what we were doing, and always giving us that independent group need to make sure this was not being in any way promotional. And at every point, we had to get sign-off from 3 different organisations. We had to get it from UCL and the Marsden and the Christie. And that never happens quickly, but we managed to somehow here. And I think that's because the governance around the whole project and what we were doing actually struck a chord with a lot of people. And when people across the NHS began to see the pace at which we were moving and what we were producing here, I think everywhere began to think this is a really good model. And it was the first example of one where simply people felt comfortable working with the industry, saw true partnership. And I think sometimes that's hard to justify or see in practice. but we managed to create that by having that tight governance around it all, and with great success.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's such a great initiative to have put into place, and it really does show that there's space for multi-stakeholder collaboration, especially when you're dealing with introduction of new innovations or technologies or therapies into our healthcare systems. At what point of the biosimilar adoption process did you introduce this pharma challenge?
Oh, it was the biosimilar project came directly from the Pharma Challenge. So it was a project that was put to us, and we said, yeah, we'll take it from there. So in fact, it stemmed from that call with the Pharma Challenge. We might have got to that process ourselves at a later stage, but I can say with honesty that had the company not approached us here, we might never produced what we did.
And so was it something that you did 6 months prior to the introduction of rituximab? Was it 3 months before the introduction? Was it at the point of introduction?
It was a year before. So it was they started working with us 12 months before, and getting the project signed off from all the governance committees across 3 organizations and their partners took us probably 6 months, I'd say. And then that was 6 months before launch of the first biosimilar, and we got cracking on producing all of this. So the first 6 months were a little slower. After that, it took off because we knew there was an urgency, and there was a deadline in mind of knowing the first products were going to become available.
Great, thank you so much for that information. I think a lot of the questions that we've got here in Canada surround patient preference.
Yes.
So if you can speak to that a little bit, and then also, do you think that the inclusion of the patients and the patient groups from the get-go helped to increase the patient's willingness and also the uptake of biosimilars?
Yes, I would say so. So I suppose there's a couple of things to give a bit of context. There isn't much use of of subcutaneous rituximab across the NHS in England. Just never has been. I think people didn't most of our clinicians, there was never a strong, overwhelming sense of wanting to use that. Patients are coming in for other treatments, so there was no additional benefit if somebody was going to be have treatment with some of our subcuts. Obviously, you can have that treatment a lot quicker or at home. There just was never that drive from our clinicians with subcut retux. So we were knowing that we were going to have an impact across a very large area, a large number of our patients, 99% usage in the NHS England is IV. So that was one thing. However, we absolutely think this wouldn't have been possible without patient groups and involving patients all the way through about education, their involvement in helping write the information sheets, but also what they would like as assurance if we were going to introduce this. So rather than producing something and then going out to everyone, we co-produced it all so that it was pitched right from the start. We involved them, we listened to them, and we gave them the assurance of all of this. And I have to admit, we realized we'd probably got that right, because when we went to eventually look at trastuzumab biosimilar, when we wrote to patients there to tell them we were going to switch them, and then some patients naturally were going to come back and ask questions, and some might have been concerned. And our large cancer charities, breast cancer charities, at that point, they were fielding a lot of those questions because they were part of our decision making, part of the information that was produced, and were able to reassure the patients alongside the NHS colleagues, the clinicians, pharmacists, and nurses. And now it's it's well accepted in that respect. Of course, we still have lots of questions when patients come through and they're going to be told they'll receive a biosimilar, and they want to know, is it going to have the same impact first and foremost? And we're in a much healthier place and knowledgeable place to be able to give that assurance. And
so, because it was an automatic switch, if I'm not mistaken, from the...
There was. So with Ritux, we switched all patients, new and existing patients, all got moved to the biosimilar.
And were there any patients who were not willing to switch to the biosimilar?
So patients had questions, and we were able to give them that assurance and explain that, this was going to have the same clinical impact, and also explaining where, if necessary, people wanted to make sure these weren't just almost second-rate copies. And sometimes we heard that question, and actually when people understood these still take 8+ years to come to market, and they still have to go through such rigorous testing to show it's got the same clinical impact, and they still have to go through a licensing route. I think they were a lot more reassured at that point. And I think it is really important to make sure people understand that, and we've got to understand that ourselves first and make sure we're content, because of course no way we want to be giving people any lesser treatments or something that's going to give them more side effects.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned during your presentation that the patients were communicated with, and it was through a letter, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so we did. So with trastuzumab in particular, our lead clinicians, and we worked with everyone to say, what's your preferred approach? And for trastuzumab, our clinical director actually wrote to all of the patients to say we'll be switching you to this. And there might be on the end of the slides I sent you, and if not, I can send this on. I've actually attached a copy of the letter, and the letter pretty much covered. I'm writing to you on behalf of all the consultants in the breast unit. You're currently receiving a biological medication called trastuzumab in this case, and then talking through about why we were switching over to biosimilar trastuzumab, and also saying, please be assured we would not be offering this alternative unless we were completely confident that it's just as effective and safe as your current treatment. And so even that choice of words we wrote with our patient groups, saying what would be the content of that. Here's what we believe. How do we make sure that's conveyed? And so we sent that letter out to all of our patients on trastuzumab, on the intravenous trastuzumab, I should hasten to add.
I've got another question about resource allocation.
Yes.
So, I mean, it'll be really interesting to see, and I think you said the report would be coming out next year, and the projected savings are rather large. And
yes.
how are the resources going to be reallocated into the healthcare system, and how I mean, is there transparency around that? Is there how is that working?
Yeah, it's a question we all get asked about, and there have been slightly different approaches to what happens with savings. The first thing is, I think everybody working in the health system wants to know that when you're making such large savings, they're going back into the system one way or another. In some cases, they might be what we have called there are some shared incentives with hospitals, and I know they did that with adalimumab. So hospitals would have had a share of the savings and to reinvest back into their service. In other cases, there might be some staffing that was supported, like infliximab. I know that happened, and there are others where I would say the savings back, and the very first graph where I showed you the rising spend and some of the controls and the impact that's made. Actually, it's also then saying how some of that is used to fund treatments like CAR T-cell therapies that we've just seen approved in the NHS in England, and we're one of the sites that's going to be offering that treatment now across the country. And seeing those personalised special treatments getting approved, some of those wouldn't have been possible without the savings and the size of savings we're making. So there is the latest commissioning document has come out saying about the success of biosimilars and a bit about being supported for the overall NHS and management of what are increasing costs everywhere. But so in some cases there are examples of direct savings going back to hospitals. Others are investment back into a service and staffing, and the other one can be is where it's helped enable newer drugs get approved. All of those have been really well received.
And you did say that it was going back into the healthcare system, so it's not going back general fund.
No, it's not. And I think that's, that is so important. And it's the advice I would say, people ought to, I think as people are making, people, I mean, your healthcare system managers need to give that some consideration, because I think most people in our organisations and our patients were delighted knowing they were helping the NHS save a lot of money. They really were. They felt they felt it was doing good because it was supporting what we're all very passionate about. And if you're not clear about how that's being reinvested back into your health systems, then actually people will be a little bit dubious about it. And when I was in Australia, they certainly, the hesitancy was just around how would the savings be realised and how would they be ploughed back into the system. And I think that's an important part that healthcare managers need to work and be explicit about how that would be reinvested back in. And I think as long as people are clear about those communication, those comms, then I think that the success of this can be shared. Everyone can be pleased it's contributing back into the healthcare systems across the world.
Yeah, I agree. I think that message really needs to be put across, especially here in Canada, where we're not really sure how the savings are going to be reallocated. But on the topic of the cost savings, what I've noticed here is that the messaging that has come across is that the introduction of the biosimilars is really a cost savings measure. And I'm wondering what sort of messaging you used with the implementation of biosimilars.
Yeah, well, there's a wider program across the NHS which we are all part of, which is called the Best Value in Medicines, and as part of the Best Value in Medicines program, biosimilars are one of the areas of focus. There are numerous other things about de-prescribing, which I think actually, my Canadian colleagues, pharmacy colleagues, I think you're all ahead of us on that. We don't do de-prescribing very well in the NHS England. We're beginning to focus on that a lot more. The polypharmacy agenda. So in the context of a wider best value program of medicines, this is one of those. And while some of this is saying, yes, it's a big cost saving, it's also rare to have a situation whereby you can have the same clinical outcomes, same adverse event profiles, but at a much lower cost. Well, actually, why wouldn't you do this? If it's going to help us get other wider benefits across the system, and people are being applauded for making those savings, and it's helping the overall value in the NHS, I think it's a good message to send out everywhere.
Yeah. So I'm conscious of time. I just have one more question and maybe just a comment afterwards. So you said that there were no practical problems noticed, and that is at with the application of biosimilars with the patients.
Yes.
Can you share with us some of the mistakes and the learnings that you had throughout the process?
Yeah. The mistakes, I think it's a great question. I think, what's my learning here was, whilst I think some of the core documents can all be shared and you can avoid duplication, one of the things I would always say, despite all of this, and I made it probably sound relatively straightforward, if you don't bring your clinicians and your nurses and your pharmacists and patients with you on this journey, at some point it will come back and people will question it. And so I would say the biggest learning for me was taking time to really identify those stakeholders, work with them. Those stakeholders are critical, and you make sure your patients from the outset and the patient groups who have a very strong and powerful voice are involved from the outset. But also, if you truly understand about the biosimilars and how they are produced, and take time to understand that, because if you don't understand that, I still see, and here's one example. So I know we've had adalimumab, we've had, I think, 4 different biosimilars on the market in the last 6 months, and there were some questions around, somebody's received an adverse event, we should go back to the originator once it's started. And that to me suggested, actually, I don't think people have fully understood that you might not see a difference if the molecules are the same and in the same formulation and the same mode of administration, there shouldn't really be a difference. And if there is, we need to understand that a lot more carefully. But it did highlight that there is never, we've never completed that full. We haven't got the buy-in from everybody around the country, and there's a constant thing about educating people on this, because people are still going to have doubts and they're still going to be slightly unsure. And so my learning is you've got to take that time to keep on supporting people, encouraging the questions, encouraging the real world evidence data collection, and making sure that you're getting regular feedback from your patients.
Excellent, thank you. So just to end this off, I think what I heard as being important considerations as we look to implement biosimilars in oncology here in Canada is that it needs to be a system-wide approach.
Yes.
We need to include all the stakeholders. There needs to be national alignment. And I heard that central repository and education were important. Is there anything else that you think?
I would say, as your patient groups, involving them quite early on is very, very important. And try and understand what the real concerns might be, or any hesitancy, and try and address those in the most open way as possible. And wherever your decision making in terms of commissioning is made, that needs to be clear about how the savings would be reinvested back into the system. I think those are some of the levers that, if you don't get right, people might just say, well, this is a lot of work, but how does everybody benefit from this? So I would say a comms quite early on at a national level to make sure that is that's made clear, so everyone's got the same aim, and then you get collectively a buy-in on that. I know it's made it perhaps a little bit trickier with the provinces, but if there's people who help you, then we'll share that and share some of those key learnings.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Jack. We've run a little bit over, but I really appreciate your time that you've given us today. And thank you to everyone who listened in. It has been recorded, and with your permission, I will share it on the Cancer Collaborative website at roomc.co.
No problem.
And thank you so much. I think that this has really provided some more insight as we start implementing this.
Not a problem at all. And if people want to contact me, delighted to take questions. Look forward to working with you all again.
Great. And I just want to, it was the Cancer Vanguard biosimilar timeline that you mentioned.
Yes.
Perfect.
And that's available for you all to have a look at.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.